It was a bright and warm afternoon as Jaden Walker made his way home from school. The sun shone down, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban streets. Jaden was just another 14-year-old boy, carrying his backpack filled with textbooks and homework, lost in his thoughts. He was focused on the plans he had made with his friends for the weekend and the upcoming math test he was both excited and nervous about. As he walked, he absent-mindedly kicked a small rock along the sidewalk, enjoying the last moments of his day. Jaden's neighborhood was usually peaceful, a place where everyone knew each other and looked out for one another. It was a mixed community, with families from all walks of life, all sharing this little pocket of the city. His father, Richard Walker, was well known and respected, not only in the community but also throughout the city. As a lieutenant in the police force, Richard had spent his career advocating for justice and fairness, values he had worked hard to instill in Jaden. But none of this mattered as Jaden approached a corner near the small convenience store he visited almost every day on his way home. Today, however, something was different. As he neared the intersection, he noticed two police officers lingering near their squad car, parked just a few feet from the sidewalk. They were talking in low voices, but stopped as soon as they saw him approaching. Jaden felt the weight of their gaze as he walked closer, and a chill ran down his spine. Their eyes were intense, sharp, and unsettling. Jaden tried to keep his head down and quickened his pace. He knew his father's advice by heart: stay calm, stay respectful, and never do anything that could be misinterpreted. But there was no way to avoid passing them on this route. Just as he was about to step past, one of the officers, a tall man with a thick beard and a hard expression, stepped directly into his path, blocking his way. "Hey, kid," the officer barked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Where do you think you're going?" Jaden stopped abruptly, his heart pounding. He swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just heading home, sir," he replied politely, hoping his calm demeanor would diffuse any tension. The officer's gaze narrowed, looking Jaden up and down with a sneer. "Just heading home, huh? A kid like you, wandering around here alone." He glanced at his partner, a younger officer with a smirk that seemed permanently etched on his face. "What's in that backpack of yours?" Jaden felt a pang of fear as he instinctively tightened his grip on the backpack straps. He glanced at the sidewalk, fighting the urge to just walk away, but he knew that wouldn't end well. "It's just my books and school stuff, sir," he managed to say, keeping his voice as even as possible. "Oh, really?" The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, and they both laughed, a cold and mocking sound. "Let's see what you've got in there," the bearded officer demanded, his tone leaving no room for refusal. Jaden hesitated, glancing down at his backpack. He felt a wave of unease wash over him, but he knew resisting would only make things worse. With trembling hands, he unzipped his backpack and began to pull out his books and notebooks, laying them on the ground at the officer's feet. The younger officer scoffed, nudging one of the books with his foot. "School books, huh? What kind of school books does a kid like you carry around?" he sneered, looking at Jaden with undisguised disdain. Jaden felt a flush of humiliation creep up his cheeks. "That's all I have, sir," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. The first officer smirked, leaning down so his face was mere inches from Jaden's. "You think you're real smart, don't you?" He spat, his voice filled with hostility. Jaden kept silent, not knowing what to say that wouldn't make the situation worse. His silence seemed to irritate the officers even more. "Think you're better than us?" the officer growled, his face twisting with bitterness. "Walking around here like you own the place. You don't belong here, you hear me?" Jaden swallowed hard, nodding slightly, his heart racing. He could feel the officer's glares bearing down on him, making him feel small, vulnerable, and trapped. The younger officer circled him slowly, his eyes glinting with a dark amusement. "Maybe we need to teach you a lesson in respect," he said, nudging Jaden's shoulder roughly. Jaden stumbled back a step, catching his balance but feeling the sting of their treatment. He glanced around, hoping someone, anyone, would notice what was happening and intervene, but the few people on the street averted their eyes and hurried past, clearly unwilling to get involved. The sense of isolation and helplessness settled heavily over him. The first officer crossed his arms, a smug look on his face. "You think your daddy's gonna protect you, huh?" he taunted. "Just because he's somebody doesn't mean you're safe. Not here." Jaden's face flushed with both anger and embarrassment. His father had always taught him to believe in justice and fairness. But here, in this moment, all those ideals seemed meaningless. These officers weren't interested in justice. They were interested in power and control. And right now, he was their target. The second officer leaned in, his eyes narrowing with a twisted satisfaction. "How about a little reminder of where you stand, kid?" He sneered, his tone dripping with malice. Before Jaden could react, the officer grabbed his backpack and emptied it onto the sidewalk, scattering his books, notebooks, and supplies across the pavement. Jaden's heart sank as he watched his belongings treated like garbage. His favorite drawing, one he'd been working on for weeks, fluttered out of his notebook and landed at the officer's feet. He bent down, picked it up, and smirked. "Oh, so we've got an artist here," he mocked, crumpling the drawing in his hand. "Maybe you should stick to coloring books, kid." He tossed the drawing onto the ground and stepped on it, grinding it into the pavement with his boot. Jaden clenched his fists at his sides, fighting back the tears that pricked the corners of his eyes. The humiliation was overwhelming, and he struggled to keep his emotions in check, knowing that any sign of defiance could escalate the situation. "Look at him," the first officer scoffed, crossing his arms with a satisfied grin. "Standing there like he's something special." The second officer chuckled darkly, turning to his partner. "You know what? Maybe we should teach him a little respect." The first officer raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, and what do you have in mind?" The younger officer smirked, removing his own boot and holding it up in front of Jaden's face. "Why don't you show us some respect and give this a taste, huh?" he said, his voice laced with contempt. Jaden's eyes widened in horror as he stared at the filthy boot in front of him. The officers were waiting, their faces twisted with sadistic pleasure. His stomach churned, and his mind raced, desperately searching for a way out of this nightmare. "Please," Jaden whispered, his voice barely audible. I haven't done anything wrong." The first officer's smirk deepened. "Did I stutter?" he hissed, shoving the boot closer to Jaden's face. "Eat it." Now, Jaden's mind went blank with terror. He wanted to resist, to shout, to scream for help, but he knew there was no one who would come to his aid. With trembling hands, he reached out, his heart breaking as he grasped the boot. As he brought it to his mouth, he could feel the officer's laughter echoing around him, each chuckle a painful reminder of his powerlessness. The humiliation was unbearable, but he knew he had no choice. This was a moment that would haunt him forever, a memory that would linger in his mind as a dark, indelible scar. Just then, a voice cut through the haze of humiliation and fear, a calm, steady voice, filled with quiet strength. "Excuse me, officers," the voice said, "but what exactly do you think you're doing?" Jaden looked up, hope flaring in his chest as he saw an older man standing a few feet away, his eyes hard and resolute as he stared down the officers. The man's presence was commanding, radiating an authority that even the officers seemed to recognize. The officers turned, their expressions shifting as they regarded the newcomer. They exchanged a quick glance, but the man's unyielding gaze didn't waver. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his voice calm but carrying a weight that left no room for defiance. The officers hesitated, the arrogance slipping from their faces as they realized they were no longer in control. The man standing before Jaden and the officers was an imposing figure, though he wasn't overly tall or broad. His presence alone seemed to demand respect. He wore a crisp, tailored suit, and his silver hair was neatly combed back, giving him a distinguished look. But what truly commanded attention were his eyes, sharp, clear, and unwavering. They held a quiet, intense power, and even the two officers, who moments before had been relishing their authority over Jayden, now found themselves shifting uncomfortably under his gaze. "Is there a problem here?" the man repeated, his voice low and steady, but carrying a gravity that suggested he was not someone to be trifled with. The first officer, the bearded one who had initiated the harassment, glanced at his partner, unsure of how to respond. He attempted to regain his composure, straightening up and adopting a posture of authority. "No problem here, sir," he replied, though his voice lacked the bravado it had held just moments earlier. "Just routine questioning." The man raised an eyebrow, his eyes moving from the officer to Jayden, whose face was still flushed with humiliation. His gaze then dropped to the ground, where Jayden's scattered belongings lay in disarray. He noted the crumpled drawing, the open books, and the officer's boots still in Jayden's hands. His jaw tightened ever so slightly. "Routine questioning, you say?" he repeated, a faint edge of skepticism in his tone. He took a step closer, his gaze locked onto the officer's, unflinching. "It doesn't look like routine questioning to me. In fact, it looks like harassment." The second officer, the younger one who had been egging on his partner, crossed his arms defensively. "Listen, sir, we're just doing our jobs. This kid looked suspicious, and we have every right to question him. There's been an uptick in, well, certain types of trouble around here," he said, his voice trailing off as he avoided meeting the man's eyes. "Trouble." The man's voice was calm but icy. "Is that what you call it?" He looked back at Jayden, who was still holding the boot, his hands trembling slightly. "Young man, what's your name?" Jayden hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jayden, sir. Jayden Walker." The man's expression softened slightly as he regarded Jayden. "Put that boot down, son. You don't need to hold it anymore." Jayden released the boot as if it were a burning coal, relief washing over his face as he let it fall to the ground. The man then turned his attention back to the officers, his gaze sharpening once more. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice carrying a quiet menace that sent a chill through the air. The officers exchanged a wary glance. The younger officer shook his head slowly, trying to maintain a semblance of authority. "No, sir, and I don't see how that's relevant." "Oh, it's very relevant," the man replied, his tone unwavering. "You see, I happen to be Raymond Walker. I'm the deputy commissioner of the police department in this city, and I'm Jayden's grandfather." The color drained from the officers' faces as they processed his words. Their smug expressions faltered, replaced by a mixture of shock and fear. Deputy Commissioner Raymond Walker was a name everyone in the department knew, even if they hadn't met him personally. He was known not only for his position, but for his unyielding commitment to justice and integrity, a reputation that had earned him both admiration and fear within the ranks. The first officer's mouth opened and closed as he struggled to find words. We didn't realize, sir," he stammered, his tone suddenly deferential. Raymond's expression remained cold. "Clearly," he replied, "and even if you hadn't known, it shouldn't have mattered. This is a child. A young boy carrying schoolbooks, walking home. Your job is to protect and serve, not intimidate and humiliate." The younger officer attempted to regain his composure, though his voice was shaky. "Sir, we were just following protocol. We thought he might be carrying something suspicious." "Suspicious?" Raymond's voice cut through the air like a blade. "And what exactly made you suspicious of him? Was it his skin color, or the fact that he was walking alone in his own neighborhood?" The officers said nothing, their faces pale as they realized the gravity of their actions. Raymond didn't give them a chance to respond. Instead, he took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Let me make something very clear," he said, his tone dripping with restrained anger. "I have spent my career fighting for justice. I have seen men like you, men who think they can abuse their authority simply because they wear a badge. But I will not tolerate this behavior, not in this department, and certainly not toward my family." The bearded officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. "Sir, we didn't mean any harm," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Raymond's gaze hardened. "You didn't mean any harm. Forcing a young boy to eat your boot is no harm to you." He shook his head in disgust. "You're a disgrace to the badge." At that moment, Jaden's father, Richard Walker, arrived. He had received a call from a concerned passerby who had witnessed part of the incident and had recognized Jaden. Richard's face was a mask of fury as he approached, his eyes blazing with anger and worry. "Dad?" Richard's voice was strained as he looked between his father, the officers, and his son, who stood with his shoulders hunched, his face downcast. Raymond turned to his son, his expression softening for a brief moment. "Richard," he said, nodding in acknowledgement before gesturing to Jaden. "It seems our officers here thought it appropriate to question Jaden in a rather demeaning manner." Richard's jaw clenched as he looked at his son's scattered belongings, the crumpled drawing, and the boot lying on the ground. "Are you both out of your minds?" he demanded, his voice barely controlled. "This is my son. He was walking home from school. What reason could you possibly have to treat him this way?" The younger officer stammered, his voice trembling. We didn't know, sir. We thought. We were just following up on a report." "A report?" Richard's voice dripped with disbelief. "A report that a child was walking home from school with books in his backpack." Raymond held up a hand, signaling for Richard to let him handle it. He turned back to the officers, his gaze icy. "This ends here," he said. "You will return to the station, and you will write a full report on this incident, detailing every word, every action. And rest assured, I will be reviewing it personally." The officers nodded, their heads bowed in shame. They gathered themselves, casting one last fearful glance at Raymond and Richard before hurrying back to their squad car and driving away without another word. As the car disappeared down the street, Jaden released a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The tension that had gripped his body began to loosen, though a lingering sense of shame and humiliation remained. He felt his father's hand on his shoulder, a steadying presence that brought him a sense of comfort he desperately needed. "Are you okay, Jaden?" Richard asked softly, his voice filled with concern and a hint of sorrow. Jaden nodded, though his face was flushed with lingering embarrassment. I didn't know what to do," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard's face softened as he crouched down to meet his son's gaze. "You did nothing wrong, Jaden. This wasn't your fault." He placed a reassuring hand on Jaden's shoulder. "I'm so sorry this happened to you." Raymond stepped forward, his eyes filled with a quiet sorrow as he looked at his grandson. "Jaden, no one should ever make you feel the way those men did. Not ever. And I promise you, they will be held accountable." Jaden looked up at his grandfather, his voice shaking as he asked, Will they lose their jobs?" Raymond's expression was resolute. "If I have any say in it, yes. They don't deserve to wear the badge." Richard nodded, echoing his father's determination. "You're safe now, Jaden. We're going to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." As they gathered up Jaden's belongings, the small crowd that had watched from afar began to disperse, though the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. Jaden's faith in authority had been shaken, but as he looked at his father and grandfather, two men who had dedicated their lives to justice, he found a glimmer of hope. They walked home together, and though the ordeal was over, Jaden knew it was something he would carry with him forever. But he also knew he wasn't alone. His family was there for him, standing strong against injustice, ready to fight for what was right. And as they walked, Jaden felt the spark of resilience flickering within him, a spark that would one day grow into a flame. He might have been humiliated, but he would rise above it, stronger and wiser. And he knew his father and grandfather would be there, every step of the way, to make sure of it. The events of that day weighed heavily on Jaden's mind long after he returned home. Even in the safety of his room, surrounded by familiar things, his posters, books, and drawings. The sense of vulnerability clung to him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the officers' sneering faces, heard their mocking laughter, felt the cold sting of their disdain. It was as if the humiliation had seeped into his bones, something he couldn't shake off, no matter how hard he tried. Downstairs, his father and grandfather were deep in conversation, their voices barely audible through the floorboards. Jayden could tell from their tones that the discussion was serious, filled with tension and worry. He knew they were talking about what had happened to him, probably trying to figure out what steps to take next. But a part of him didn't want to think about it anymore. He just wanted to forget, to pretend it had never happened. Yet, pretending was impossible. As he sat at his desk, staring at the crumpled drawing the officers had mocked and trampled on, he felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Anger, humiliation, sadness, and a gnawing sense of injustice. Why did they have to treat him that way? What had he done to deserve it? Suddenly, there was a knock at his door, breaking him out of his thoughts. His father, Richard, stepped into the room, his face a mixture of concern and warmth. He approached Jayden cautiously, as if sensing the delicate state his son was in. "Hey, champ," Richard said softly, pulling up a chair next to Jayden. "How are you holding up?" Jayden shrugged, his eyes still fixed on the drawing in front of him. I don't know," he mumbled, struggling to put his feelings into words. "I just feel different, like things aren't the same anymore." Richard nodded, his expression somber. "I get it, Jayden. What happened today? It was wrong. No one should ever have to go through something like that, especially not you." Jayden glanced up at his father, a question lingering in his eyes. "Dad, why did they do it? Why did they treat me like that? I didn't do anything wrong." Richard took a deep breath, as if gathering his thoughts. He placed a comforting hand on Jayden's shoulder. "Sometimes, people make assumptions about others based on how they look, where they're from, or the color of their skin. It's not fair, and it's not right, but it happens. And unfortunately, there are people who let their prejudices influence their actions, even when they're supposed to uphold justice." Jayden looked down, his hands clenched into fists. "It just feels so unfair. I didn't do anything. I was just walking home." "I know, Jayden," Richard said gently. "And that's what makes it so wrong. You didn't deserve any of it." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the quiet ticking of the clock on Jayden's wall. After a moment, Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He handed it to Jayden, who looked at it curiously. It was a black-and-white photo of a young man, about Jayden's age, with a solemn expression and piercing eyes. "Who's this?" Jayden asked, studying the photo. Richard's gaze softened as he looked at the picture. "That's your great-grandfather, Daniel Walker. He was a civil rights activist back in the 1960s, fought for equality and justice, marched in protests, even got arrested a few times for standing up for what he believed in." Jayden's eyes widened in awe. He'd heard stories about his great-grandfather before, but he hadn't known much about the struggles he'd faced. He looks brave." "He was," Richard replied, his voice filled with pride. "He stood up against people who tried to put him down, who told him he didn't belong, who tried to strip him of his dignity. But he never gave in. He always held his head high, because he knew he was fighting for something bigger than himself." Jayden looked back at the photo, feeling a newfound sense of connection to the man in it. Do you think I could be like him?" Richard smiled, a glint of pride in his eyes. "I know you can, Jayden. You have the same strength, the same resilience. What happened today was hard, and it's okay to feel hurt. But remember that you come from a long line of fighters, people who stood up for what was right, no matter how tough things got." Jayden felt a spark of determination ignite within him, mingling with the lingering anger he felt. He realized that he didn't want to let this experience define him. He wanted to rise above it, to show those officers and the world that he was more than what they had tried to make him feel. As if sensing his thoughts, Richard placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to carry this burden alone, Jaden. Your family is here for you. Your mom, your grandpa, and I. We're all here to support you, and we're going to make sure that those officers are held accountable for what they did." Jaden nodded, a newfound resolve taking root within him. He looked up at his father, his voice steady. "I want to help. I don't know how, but I want to do something. I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through." Richard's eyes shone with pride. "We'll find a way together. And maybe, by speaking out, we can make a difference." The next day, Richard and Raymond accompanied Jaden to the police station to file a formal complaint against the officers. Jaden's mother, Sarah, joined them, her presence a reassuring comfort. As they walked into the station, heads turned, whispers filled the air, and several officers exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear that word of the incident had already spread, and the arrival of the deputy commissioner and his family was drawing attention. Raymond led them into the office of Chief Bernard Hayes, a stout man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a stern expression. Chief Hayes looked visibly uncomfortable as he greeted them, his eyes flicking nervously from Raymond to Jaden, and back again. "Deputy Commissioner Walker," he began, his tone forced but polite. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Raymond wasted no time with pleasantries. His voice was cold and unyielding. "Chief Hayes, we're here to file a formal complaint against 2 of your officers for misconduct, harassment, and abuse of authority. My grandson, Jaden, was targeted and humiliated simply for walking home from school." Chief Hayes's face paled slightly, though he attempted to maintain his composure. I see. Of course, we take these matters very seriously, Deputy Commissioner. I assure you, we'll conduct a thorough investigation." Raymond's expression remained steely. "I expect nothing less, Chief Hayes, and I'll be overseeing this investigation personally to ensure that justice is served." The chief nodded, clearly uncomfortable under Raymond's piercing gaze. "Understood, sir. We'll handle this matter with the utmost care." After filing the complaint, the family returned home, but Jaden couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He felt a sense of empowerment in taking action, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to erase the hurt. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions and activity, with reporters reaching out, community leaders offering support, and neighbors expressing their solidarity. One evening, a week after the incident, the Walkers were invited to speak at a community meeting organized by local activists. The room was filled with people of all ages, backgrounds, and ethnicities, all gathered to address the issue of police misconduct and to show their support for Jaden. As they took their seats, Jaden looked around, overwhelmed by the number of people who had come to stand with him. When it was his turn to speak, Jaden took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He stepped up to the microphone, feeling the weight of all those eyes on him, but also feeling the support radiating from his family seated nearby. He glanced down at the photo of his great-grandfather that he brought with him, drawing strength from the legacy of resilience that ran through his veins. "Thank you, everyone, for being here," he began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "A week ago, something happened to me that I never thought I'd experience. I was walking home from school, just like any other day, but 2 officers stopped me. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as a threat. They treated me like I was less than human, and it hurt." He paused, his throat tightening, but he pressed on, feeling the support of the crowd buoying him up. "But I don't want to stay silent. I don't want anyone else to feel the way I felt. I want to stand up, just like my great-grandfather did, and fight for what's right." The audience erupted in applause, a wave of support washing over him. Jaden felt a sense of empowerment he had never felt before, as if he had tapped into a strength he hadn't known he possessed. He looked over at his family, who were beaming with pride, and knew that he wasn't alone in this fight. The meeting continued late into the night, with community members sharing their own experiences, voicing their outrage and brainstorming ways to bring about change. As the following days were a whirlwind of activity for Jaden and his family. The community meeting had ignited a spark, and the story of what happened to Jaden began spreading throughout the town and beyond. Local newspapers covered it, and social media posts about the incident started to gain traction. People were outraged. They couldn't believe that something like this could happen to a young boy in their own neighborhood. Jaden's father, Richard, worked tirelessly to gather evidence and rally support. He reached out to local leaders, activists, and even some lawyers who specialized in civil rights cases. The goal was clear: to ensure that the officers involved were held accountable and that changes were made to prevent such incidents from happening again. For Jaden, life felt surreal. He'd gone from a quiet existence to suddenly becoming the focal point of a movement. Every day after school, people from the community would stop by their house to offer words of encouragement or share their own experiences with police harassment. It was eye-opening for Jaden to see how many people had faced similar situations. He realized that his story was just one of many, and that by speaking up, he was giving a voice to others who had been silenced. One evening, Jaden's family received an invitation to a rally organized by the local youth activist group, Voices Unheard. They wanted Jaden to speak about his experience, to inspire other young people to stand up against injustice. Jaden was nervous. Speaking at the community meeting had been one thing, but this rally was expected to draw a huge crowd. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that kind of attention. Sensing his hesitation, his grandfather, Raymond, sat down with him on the porch the night before the rally. The two of them watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Raymond was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his words held weight. "Jaden," he began, his voice calm and steady, "I know this is a lot to handle. You've been through more than any kid your age should have to bear. But remember, you're not just doing this for yourself. You're doing this for all the people who feel powerless, who've been silenced and forgotten." Jaden looked down, fidgeting with his hands. I don't know if I'm strong enough, Grandpa. I'm scared I'll mess up or say the wrong thing." Raymond chuckled softly, putting a reassuring hand on Jaden's shoulder. "Strength doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you keep going, even when you are. And besides, you've got all of us here to support you. You're not in this alone." The next evening, Jaden's family arrived at the rally. The air was electric with energy, people holding signs that read "Justice for Jaden" and "End Police Harassment." The crowd was a mix of people from all backgrounds, young and old, students, parents, teachers, and community leaders. The stage was set in a local park, decorated with banners and a microphone stand that looked intimidating in its simplicity. As Jaden approached the stage, his heart raced. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, every expectation pressing down on his shoulders. His parents and grandfather stood nearby, giving him reassuring nods. With a deep breath, he stepped up to the microphone, gripping it tightly as he began to speak. "Thank you all for being here," he started, his voice trembling slightly. "A few weeks ago, I was just a regular kid, walking home from school. But then something happened that changed my life. I was stopped by two police officers who treated me like I was a criminal just because of how I look. They humiliated me, made me feel small, and I felt powerless." He paused, gathering his emotions. The crowd was silent, hanging on to every word. "But I'm standing here today because I don't want anyone else to feel that way," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "No one should be made to feel like they don't belong, like they're not good enough because of the color of their skin or where they come from. I'm here because I want things to change. I want my friends, my family, and everyone in this community to feel safe, no matter who they are." A wave of applause rippled through the crowd, people cheering and clapping in solidarity. Jaden felt a surge of confidence, fueled by the support of those around him. "And I know that change isn't easy," he went on, his gaze scanning the sea of faces before him. "But we can't just sit back and hope things get better. We have to make them better. We have to hold people accountable when they abuse their power. And we have to stand together, as a community, to demand justice." As he finished speaking, the crowd erupted in applause, a standing ovation for the young boy who had shown such courage. Jaden stepped back, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. His family hugged him tightly, their faces beaming with pride. After the rally, a man approached Jaden and his family. He introduced himself as Attorney Marcus Hayes, a well-known civil rights lawyer in the area. He had heard about Jaden's story and was moved by the courage he had shown. "Jaden, you have a powerful story," Attorney Hayes said, his voice filled with admiration. "And I believe that together, we can make a real difference. I'd like to represent you and help bring those officers to justice, not just for you, but for everyone who's faced similar treatment." Jaden looked up at his parents, unsure. The idea of taking legal action was daunting, but the look in his father's eyes was one of resolve. "We're in this together, son," Richard said, squeezing Jaden's shoulder. "Whatever you decide, we'll support you." Jaden took a deep breath, nodding. "Okay," he said softly, looking up at Attorney Hayes. "I want to do it. I want to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." In the weeks that followed, Jaden's life became a mix of school, family time, and legal meetings with Attorney Hayes. They filed a formal lawsuit against the police department, citing racial discrimination, harassment, and abuse of power. The case drew significant media attention, with reporters and news outlets covering the story. Jaden's face appeared on television, in newspapers, and on social media, his story inspiring people across the country. As the case gained momentum, more people came forward to share their own experiences with police harassment. The community began to rally around Jaden, organizing protests, marches, and gatherings to demand accountability from the police department. The movement grew, fueled by a shared desire for justice and equality. One evening, as Jaden was preparing for bed, his grandfather came into his room, carrying a small worn journal. He handed it to Jaden, who looked at it curiously. "This belonged to your great-grandfather, Daniel," Raymond explained, his voice filled with emotion. "He kept a journal of his experiences, his thoughts, his dreams for a better world. I think you might find some inspiration in it." Jaden opened the journal, his fingers tracing the faded ink on the pages. The words written by his great-grandfather were powerful, filled with hope and resilience. There were entries about marches, speeches, and moments of fear, but also moments of triumph. Jaden felt a deep connection to the man he had never met, realizing that the fight for justice ran deep in his family's blood. The trial date finally arrived, and Jaden found himself standing in a courtroom, flanked by his family and Attorney Hayes. The officers who had harassed him sat on the other side, their expressions defiant. But Jaden stood tall, his gaze unwavering. He knew that he was no longer just a boy who had been humiliated on the street. He was a symbol of strength, resilience, and the power of standing up for what was right. During his testimony, Jaden spoke with a clarity and conviction that left everyone in the room in awe. He recounted the events of that day, describing the fear, humiliation, and anger he had felt. His voice was steady, his words powerful, as he conveyed the impact the incident had had on him and his family. When Attorney Hayes questioned the officers, their responses were evasive, their attempts to justify their actions flimsy. It became clear to everyone in the courtroom that their actions had been motivated by prejudice and abuse of power. As the trial came to an end, the judge delivered a powerful verdict, ruling in favor of Jaden and condemning the officers' actions. The police department was ordered to implement mandatory training on racial sensitivity and accountability measures to prevent such incidents from happening again. The officers involved were suspended, pending further investigation. The verdict was a victory not just for Jaden, but for the entire community. People celebrated, feeling a renewed sense of hope and justice. Jaden became a local hero, his story serving as a catalyst for change. Later that night, as he sat on the porch with his family, Jaden looked up at the stars, a sense of peace settling over him. He knew that the fight for justice was far from over, but he also knew that he had the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. With his family by his side and his great-grandfather's legacy in his heart, Jaden felt ready to continue the journey, no matter how difficult it might be. Because now, he understood that change wasn't just a distant dream. It was something he could help build, one step at a time, and he knew that he was no longer alone. The aftermath of the trial brought about a mix of emotions for Jaden and his family. The courtroom victory had been monumental, not just for him, but for the entire community. It was a turning point, a reminder that justice could prevail even in the face of overwhelming odds. However, the battle was far from over. For every supporter, there seemed to be someone who resented the outcome, and Jaden quickly realized that changing attitudes would take more than just one case. The next few weeks felt like a balancing act. Jaden returned to school, trying to regain some semblance of normalcy, but things had changed. Some students looked at him with admiration, while others, echoing sentiments they'd likely heard at home, regarded him with hostility. Whispers followed him in the hallways, and he could feel the weight of every stare. Teachers, once casual and friendly, now seemed overly formal, as though they were treading on eggshells around him. One afternoon, Jaden found himself sitting alone in the cafeteria, pushing his food around on his tray. The room buzzed with the usual chatter, but he felt strangely detached, as if he were an observer rather than a participant. Just as he was about to get up and leave, a familiar face appeared across the table. It was Malik, one of his classmates, and a friend he hadn't spoken to much since the incident. "Hey man," Malik greeted him, sliding into the seat across from him. "I heard about everything. Just wanted to say, I think what you did, it's pretty brave." Jaden gave a small appreciative nod, though he didn't quite know how to respond. "Thanks, Malik. It's been a lot, you know." Malik nodded. "I get it. My cousin went through something similar a few years ago. The cops harassed him for no reason, just 'cause he was walking in the wrong neighborhood. He never spoke up, though, just kept it to himself." Jaden looked up, surprised. "Really? I didn't know." "Yeah, I mean, he didn't have a dad like yours, you know," Malik said, trying to keep his voice low. "Your dad's someone in this town. People know his name. My cousin didn't have that kind of backup." Jaden thought about that, the weight of Malik's words settling over him. It was true. His father's position had given him a level of visibility, and to some extent, protection. But even with that, he'd still been vulnerable. What about the kids who didn't have that? The ones who suffered in silence? "Your cousin ever talk about it?" Jaden asked, curiosity piqued. "Sometimes," Malik admitted, "but mostly he just let it go. Said it wasn't worth the trouble. I guess a lot of people feel that way." He paused, studying Jaden's expression. "But what you did, it showed people that they don't have to stay quiet, that they can fight back." Jaden managed a small smile. "Yeah, I hope so. But it's hard. Sometimes I wonder if it's even worth it, you know." Malik leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It is, man. Trust me. You might not see it now, but you're making a difference. And you're not alone." Jaden felt a swell of gratitude for Malik's words. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that. Someone telling him that his efforts mattered, that he wasn't just shouting into the void. Over the next few days, Jaden started to notice a subtle shift around him. Students who had once looked at him with suspicion began to approach him, asking questions about the trial, expressing their support, or simply sharing their own experiences. It was as if his bravery had given others permission to speak up, to share their stories, and connect with one another in ways they hadn't before. The school administration also took notice. One morning, Jaden was called into the principal's office, where he was met by Mr. Green, the principal, and a woman he didn't recognize. She introduced herself as Ms. Latham, a representative from the school district's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. "Jaden, thank you for coming in," Mr. Green began, his tone formal but warm. "We've been following your story closely, and we're impressed with how you've handled everything. Your courage has brought to light issues that we as a school need to address." Ms. Latham nodded, her gaze steady. "We're looking into implementing some changes in our curriculum and student policies to ensure that all students feel safe and respected. We were wondering if you'd be interested in joining a student advisory board to help guide us in this process." Jaden was taken aback. The idea of being part of something that could shape the future of his school was daunting, but it was also exciting. "You mean, like, helping decide what the school should teach?" "Exactly," Ms. Latham replied. "Your perspective is valuable, Jaden. You've experienced things firsthand that most of us haven't, and that insight is crucial if we're going to make real change." Jaden took a deep breath, considering the offer. He thought back to the moments of helplessness he felt, the humiliation, the fear. If he could help prevent others from feeling that way, then maybe all of this, everything he'd gone through, would be worth it. "I'd like that," he said finally, a sense of purpose solidifying within him. "I want to help." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings and discussions. Jaden found himself sitting alongside teachers, administrators, and other students, brainstorming ways to make the school a more inclusive environment. They discussed everything from anti-bullying campaigns to workshops on racial sensitivity and empathy. Jaden spoke openly about his experience, and though it was painful to revisit, he knew that each word he shared was building towards something greater. At home, Jaden's father was also working tirelessly. Richard had continued to press the police department for accountability, attending city council meetings, speaking to local leaders, and organizing community gatherings. The case had sparked a movement, and Richard had become one of its most vocal leaders. He was determined to see real reform within the police department, starting with mandatory training on bias and de-escalation techniques. One evening, after a particularly intense meeting, Richard sat down with Jaden in the living room. They both looked exhausted, but there was a sense of quiet determination between them. "You've done good, son," Richard said, his voice filled with pride. "I know it's been hard, but you've stood tall through it all. You're stronger than I ever could have hoped." Jaden smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest. "Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "No, Jaden. You did this on your own. You had the courage to speak up, even when it was hard. That's something no one can take from you." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their thoughts. Jaden felt a sense of contentment, knowing that he was part of something bigger than himself. He was making a difference, not just for himself, but for others who had suffered in silence. But the journey was far from over. As the community pushed for police reform, there was resistance from some city officials and members of the police department who resented the scrutiny. Anonymous threats had been made against Richard, and some people openly criticized Jaden's family, claiming they were trying to stir up trouble. Jaden heard whispers at school, saw the sideways glances from certain teachers and students, but he stood firm. He knew that change was never easy, and that there would always be those who resisted progress. One afternoon, as Jaden was walking home from school, he noticed a group of younger kids gathered in the playground. They were huddled around a boy who looked to be about 9 or 10, his face flushed with anger as he argued with another boy. Curious, Jaden approached, and he quickly realized what was happening. The boy, who was black, was being taunted by another kid, who was sneering and saying something about knowing his place. Jaden felt a surge of anger, memories of his own experience flooding back. He walked over, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "Hey, you okay?" he asked softly. The boy looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and defiance. He nodded, though it was clear he was shaken. Jaden turned to the other kid, his expression firm. "You don't talk to people like that. Everyone deserves respect." understand." The boy muttered something under his breath before walking away, leaving Jaden and the younger boy standing together. The boy looked up at Jaden, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thanks," he said quietly. "People don't usually stick up for me." Jaden smiled, feeling a deep sense of purpose. "You're not alone," he replied. "And you never have to be. Just remember, you're stronger than you think." As Jaden continued his walk home, he realized that he'd come full circle. He was no longer the scared, intimidated kid who had been humiliated on the street. He was someone who could stand up for himself and for others, someone who could inspire change. And in that moment, he understood that his journey was just beginning. There would always be challenges, but he was ready to face them, armed with the knowledge that he was part of a community that believed in him. In the distance, he could see his house, his. The winter air was crisp as Jaden walked toward the community center that evening, bundled against the chill. His breath hung in the air, each exhale a reminder of the cold, but his heart felt warm and resolute. Tonight was a big night, a community gathering organized by his father and other local leaders to discuss the next steps toward lasting change. They had been planning it for weeks, with members of the community coming together to confront the issues that had long simmered beneath the surface. As he approached the community center, Jaden was struck by the crowd already gathering. People of all ages and backgrounds were huddled together, some carrying signs of support, others simply looking around with a mix of hope and apprehension. He recognized a few faces from school, teachers who had quietly supported him, classmates who had spoken up since his ordeal. His father, Richard, was standing near the entrance, greeting attendees and directing them inside with a reassuring smile. "Hey, Jaden," a voice called, and Jaden turned to see Malik jogging over to him, grinning. "You ready for this?" Jaden smiled, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's all a little overwhelming, but yeah, I'm ready." Malik patted him on the shoulder. "Good, because people are looking up to you, man. They're here because you showed them that it's okay to fight back." Jaden took a deep breath, steadying himself. He could feel the weight of Malik's words, the responsibility that came with this new role. But rather than feeling burdened, he felt empowered. The fear he'd once felt had transformed into determination. He wasn't just here for himself anymore. He was here for everyone who had ever been mistreated, silenced, or made to feel small. Inside the community center, rows of chairs faced a makeshift stage at the front, where a podium stood waiting. As people filled the seats, Jaden found a spot near the stage, watching as the room quickly reached capacity. Conversations buzzed around him, some people exchanging stories, others discussing the recent trial and the movement that had grown out of it. The energy in the room was palpable, a mix of anger, hope, and the desire for change. Finally, Richard stepped up to the podium, and the room fell silent. He scanned the crowd, his face filled with pride and determination. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent years fighting for justice. "We're here because of a young man who had the courage to stand up when others would have stayed silent. We're here because of his resilience, his bravery, and the example he set for all of us. But tonight isn't just about one person's story. It's about all of us. It's about creating a community where every person, no matter their race, background, or circumstance, is treated with dignity and respect." There was a murmur of agreement throughout the room, heads nodding, faces intent. Jaden felt his chest swell with pride as his father continued, speaking passionately about the need for accountability, for reform, for a community that didn't just stand by when injustice occurred. Richard gestured toward Jaden, beckoning him to the podium. "And now, I'd like to invite my son to share a few words with us. Jaden, if you're ready." Jaden's heart pounded as he stood up, the eyes of everyone in the room turning to him. He walked to the podium, his hands gripping its edges as he steadied himself. He took a moment, glancing over the crowd, seeing faces both familiar and unfamiliar, people who had come to support him, to be part of this change. "Hi, everyone," he began, his voice strong despite his nerves. Well, I'm just a kid, really. I'm just someone who had a really bad experience and decided I didn't want anyone else to go through what I did." He paused, the memory of that day flashing through his mind. The fear, the humiliation, the helplessness. But he pushed it aside, focusing on the strength he found since then. "What happened to me wasn't just about me," he continued. "It was about something bigger. It was about a system that sometimes fails people, that treats some of us like we don't belong, like we're not worthy of respect. But that's not true. Every single person in this room deserves to feel safe. We all deserve to walk down the street without fear, to be treated with kindness, to have our voices heard." A few people clapped, and Jaden felt a surge of confidence. "I know that change is hard. I know that some people don't think we need it. But we can't ignore what's wrong just because it's uncomfortable. We have to face it. We have to fight for a future where every kid, every person, feels like they're part of something bigger, like they're protected, like they matter." He glanced at his father, who gave him an encouraging nod, and he took a deep breath before continuing. "I'm not here to be a hero. I'm here because I believe we can do better. And I believe that if we work together, if we speak up, if we refuse to stay silent, we can make this community, and maybe even the world, a better place for everyone." The room erupted into applause, and Jaden felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He had spoken from his heart, and the response was overwhelming. People rose from their seats, clapping, some even cheering, and he could see tears in the eyes of a few audience members. His message had resonated, and he felt a sense of unity that he hadn't known was possible. As he stepped down from the podium, his father wrapped him in a tight hug, pride shining in his eyes. "You did good, son," Richard whispered. "You did real good." The rest of the evening was a blur of conversations and plans. People approached Jaden to thank him, to share their own stories, to offer their support. He met with community leaders, activists, and allies, all of whom were eager to keep the momentum going. Together, they discussed ideas for reform, for community programs, for building a future where incidents like Jaden's would be a thing of the past. By the end of the night, Jaden was exhausted but filled with a sense of fulfillment he'd never experienced before. He knew that this was just the beginning, that there would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had a community behind him, people who believed in the same vision, the same hope for a world where justice and kindness prevailed. As he and his father walked home under the quiet night sky, Jaden felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The journey had been painful, but it had led him here, to a place of purpose, a place of strength. He glanced up at the stars, feeling a deep sense of peace. "Dad," he said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Yeah, son. Thank you. For everything. For standing by me. For believing in me." Richard smiled, his arm resting around Jaden's shoulders. "I'm proud of you, Jaden. And remember, this is only the beginning. The world may not change overnight, but with people like you leading the way, I know we're headed in the right direction." Jaden nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude and determination. He knew that the road ahead would be long, that there would be more obstacles, more moments of doubt. But he also knew that he had the courage to face it, to stand up not just for himself, but for others who couldn't yet find their voice. As they reached their home, Jaden paused on the porch, looking out into the night. He thought about all the people who had supported him, the strangers who had become friends, the allies he hadn't known he had. He thought about the future he wanted to help build, a future where kids like him could grow up without fear, where respect was a given, not a privilege. And in that moment, he made a silent promise to himself and to everyone who had stood by him. He would continue to fight, to speak up, to push for a world where justice and compassion ruled. No matter how long it took, no matter how hard the journey, he was ready. For himself, for his community, and for the future he believed in.